The men on Ridgway's general store porch watched Thomas Mercer ride past, and not one of them called out a greeting. 3 summers ago, that same man had bought rounds for everyone after selling his spring herd. Laughed loud, tipped his hat to the ladies, talked about expanding his operation to 800 head by the following year. Now his boots showed patches where the leather had worn through. His horse moved slow, ribs visible beneath a dull coat. The whole picture told a story the town had been reading for months. "There goes the Mercer place," said Dole Hawkins, leaning against the porch rail. "Just a matter of time now." Silas Fletcher, who ran the feed store, shook his head slow. "Started with 200 head. Heard he's down under 100 now. Creek dried up back in May. Been hauling water from the well ever since. But that's going too. How much time he got?" Harold Dunn stepped forward from the shadows of the storefront. The banker wore a clean vest despite the heat, his watch chain catching the morning light. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, consulted it with the air of a man reviewing a patient's final diagnosis. "Thomas Mercer's got maybe 60 days, Harold said. "I've already got 3 buyers lined up for that land. Good grazing acres when the drought breaks. Shame, really." He tucked the notebook away. "His father built that place from nothing. Now it'll go for $12 an acre, maybe less." The men watched Thomas dismount at the feed store down the street. He moved careful, like a man carrying something heavy that nobody else could see. Went inside, came out a few minutes later with a single bag of grain, the minimum purchase. Barely enough to matter. He didn't look at anyone as he loaded the bag. Didn't tip his hat to Mrs. Patterson crossing the street. Just climbed back on that thin horse and rode out the way he came, shoulders hunched forward like he was pushing against a wind that wasn't there. "Pride's a hard thing to swallow," Bill said. "Man used to walk tall in this town." Harold Dunn smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Pride don't pay the bank. 60 days, gentlemen. Mark my words." The heat hit Thomas like a wall when he crested the ridge and looked down at what used to be his future. 640 acres of dying land spread below him, the grass brown and brittle, the creek bed showing nothing but cracked mud where water used to run clear and cold. The stock pond had shrunk to a muddy circle, maybe 18 inches deep at the center, with 87 cattle clustering around it like refugees waiting for rescue that wasn't coming. He rode down slow, counting losses without wanting to. That morning he'd found 2 more dead in the east pasture, a heifer and her calf, both too weak to stand when the sun came up. Made 13 this month. 47 since the drought started 3 summers back. His son Daniel was hauling water when Thomas reached the yard. 12 years old, the boy had his mother's dark hair and his father's stubborn jaw. He carried 2 buckets on a yoke across his shoulders, water sloshing with each step of the 40-yard walk from the well to the horse trough. "That's the 6th trip today," Daniel said, setting the buckets down. "Well's running slow. Took 20 minutes to fill these." Thomas dismounted, tied his horse to the rail. "We'll dig deeper tomorrow. See if we can find more flow." "Paw." Daniel wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "Maybe we should -EO." "Don't." Thomas heard the sharpness in his own voice, softened it. "We'll manage, son. We always have." But the words sounded hollow even to him. He walked past the barn, past the chicken coop where 6 hens scratched in dirt too dry to hold worms, past the small fenced garden where his wife Sarah had grown tomatoes and beans before the fever took her 4 summers back. Her grave sat on the hill above the house, marked with a simple wooden cross he'd carved himself. Sometimes he wondered what she'd think, watching him fail at everything they'd built together. The sound of hoofbeats brought his head up. A rider coming in from the North Road, old Jack Hendricks, his neighbor from the next property over. Jack was 65, thin as a fence post, with a face like tanned leather and eyes that had seen more drought years than Thomas had lived. Jack pulled up at the porch, didn't dismount. Just sat there looking at the land, the cattle, the dried creek bed. Then he looked at Thomas, Mind if I sit a spell? Thomas gestured at the porch steps. Water's in the kitchen. Help yourself. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the yard. Daniel finished his water hauling and went inside to start supper. The smell of salt pork and biscuits drifted out through the open window. Lost everything in '64, Jack said finally. His voice was quiet, matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. Every head. All 340 of them. Took me 6 years to build that herd, and one bad winter to lose it all. Thought I'd die too. Thought about making it happen a few times. Thomas didn't say anything. Didn't know what to say. Land will break, Thomas. Jack turned to look at him directly. Breaks every man eventually. Drought, or flood, or fire, or something else. Land always finds a way to remind us we're just borrowing it for a while. That's supposed to make me feel better. Nope. Jack leaned back against the porch rail. But here's the thing I learned. Sitting in the ashes of everything I'd built. Character bends. Land breaks, but character just bends. Holds, if you let it. You still got that. Thomas shook his head. Character don't pay the bank, Jack. Character don't fill water troughs or put weight on cattle. I got 60 days before Harold Dunn owns this place, and all the character in Wyoming won't change that math. Jack stood slow and careful like his joints were arguing with him. Walked to his horse and mounted up. Looked back at Thomas one more time. Maybe not, he said. But character's the only thing that survives when the bank takes everything else. Remember that. When you got nothing left, you'll find out what was worth keeping all along. He rode off without waiting for a response. Thomas sat on the porch until the stars came out, watching his cattle huddle around water that was disappearing day by day, thinking about what would be left when there was nothing left at all.
The stagecoach from Cheyenne arrived 3 days later, bringing the usual mail, supplies, and exactly one passenger, a woman in a gray traveling dress who stepped down onto Ridgeway's dusty main street and looked around with the careful attention of someone making calculations. The men on the general store porch noticed her immediately. Hard not to, she was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two older, with brown hair pinned up practical beneath a simple bonnet and eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Her dress was well made, but not fancy. The kind of clothes a woman wore when she expected to work rather than be admired. That's the Bennett woman, Silas Fletcher said, consulting his mental catalog of town business. William Bennett's sister. Come to settle his estate, I heard. Which Bennett place? The 80 acres east of town. Small parcel, but it's got that spring-fed creek. Still running, last I heard. The woman, Clara Bennett, according to the stage manifest, collected her single trunk and walked toward the boarding house without asking directions. She moved like she knew where she was going, even in a town she'd never visited. Over the next few days, the town watched her the way small towns always watch newcomers. She met with the lawyer about her brother's estate, visited the land office to confirm the property boundaries, asked questions at the general store about local ranching operations, cattle prices, drought conditions. Took notes in a small leather ledger she carried everywhere. Educated, Mrs. Patterson told the ladies' sewing circle. You can tell by the way she writes everything down. Probably one of those Eastern women who thinks she knows better than everyone. She's a widow, Mrs. Hawkins added. Husband died 3 years back. Typhoid, I heard. She nursed him for 6 weeks before he passed. What's she doing out here then? Nothing in Ridgeway for a widow with education. Nobody had an answer for that. Clara Bennett stood in the doorway of the feed store, watching a man count coins with painful precision. She'd noticed him before, hard not to, given how the townspeople talked about him. Thomas Mercer, the failing rancher, the man with 60 days. Every conversation in Ridgeway seemed to include him, usually with the kind of hushed pity people reserve for those already dead. But watching him now, she saw something different than failure. He had 47 cents spread across the counter, arranged in neat stacks, counting twice to make sure. When the total came up short for what he needed, he didn't argue or complain, just nodded, selected the smaller bag of grain, and apologized to the clerk for not buying more. Sorry, Silas. Times are tight. I'll make up the difference when things turn around. The clerk, Silas Fletcher, Clara had learned, shook his head with something between pity and dismissal. Don't worry about it, Thomas. We all understand. But Thomas Mercer didn't leave right away. He stood there for a moment, hand on the smaller grain bag, and his face showed something that looked less like defeat than determination, poorly disguised as acceptance. Like a man who'd lost the battle but hadn't admitted it to himself yet. He hefted the bag, nodded to Silas, and walked past Clara without seeing her. She caught a glimpse of work-roughened hands, patched boots, a shirt washed so many times the color had faded to something between blue and gray. And eyes, blue eyes that looked straight ahead because looking around might mean meeting someone's pity. After he left, Clara approached the counter. The man who just left? Thomas Mercer? Silas leaned on the counter, settling in for gossip. That's him. Sad case. Had 200 head 3 years ago. Down to under 100 now. Creek dried up, back in May. Banks coming for the place inside 2 months. He seems... Clara paused, searching for the right word. Determined. Silas laughed, not unkindly. Determined to fail, maybe. Man won't take help from anyone. Too proud. Turned down 3 offers to buy his stock at fair price before the cattle lost too much weight. Now they're worth half what they were, and he's still holding on like the drought's gonna break tomorrow. Clara made a note in her ledger. What about the rest of his situation? Family? Wife died 4 years back. Fever. Got a boy, 12 years old. Good kid, helps with the place. Silas shook his head. Shame, really. Thomas Mercer's a decent man. Just can't get out of his own way. Clara purchased what she needed, lamp oil, writing paper, a tin of tea, and walked out into the afternoon heat. She could see Thomas Mercer's thin horse tied at the end of the street, the man himself loading his single bag of grain. A decent man, Silas had said. Too proud to accept help. Apologized for buying less. She watched him mount up and ride out, shoulders hunched against the weight of his own failure. That's a man who hasn't given up, she thought. Not yet. 5 days later, Clara Bennett arrived at the Mercer Ranch uninvited. Thomas saw her coming from a quarter-mile away, a buggy raising dust on the north road, moving steady toward his property. He set down the shovel he'd been using to dig around the well and waited on the porch, arms crossed, expression neutral. She pulled up in the yard, set the brake, and climbed down without waiting for help, moved across the dry ground with purpose, her gray dress showing dust at the hem. Mr. Mercer. Ma'am, he didn't move from the porch. Help you with something? I'm Clara Bennett. My brother owned the 80 acres east of town. I've inherited it. She stood at the base of the steps, looking up at him with those calculating eyes. I'd like to discuss a business proposition. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. If you're here to buy my land, save yourself the trip. I'm not selling. I'm not here to buy your land. She climbed the steps without invitation, walked past him to examine the view. The dying grass, the diminished stock pond. The cattle clustered in what little shade the barn provided. I'm here because I have $400 and 80 acres with water, and I'm looking to understand how ranching works before I decide what to do with my inheritance. Then find someone else to teach you. I'm not running a school. Clara turned to face him. I'm not asking for lessons, Mr. Mercer. I'm offering partnership. The word hung in the air between them. Thomas stared at her, waiting for the catch. My brother left me capital and land, she continued. You have experience and cattle. The drought won't last forever. When it breaks, I'd like to be positioned to benefit. She pulled that ledger from her bag. I reviewed the county records. Your property has good grazing potential in normal years. My property has water rights that can serve both parcels. Together we have the foundation for a viable operation.
Together. Thomas tasted the word like it might be poison. You mean you want to invest in a failing ranch? I want to invest in a rancher who hasn't given up. He laughed, short, bitter. Lady, I'm 60 days from losing everything. The bank owns more of this place than I do. My cattle are dying faster than I can count them. What exactly makes you think I'm worth investing in?
Clara met his eyes without flinching. You apologized to the clerk for buying less grain. You counted your coins twice to make sure you weren't asking for credit. Your son helps you haul water instead of running wild in town. She paused. You feed your cattle before you feed yourself. I watched you at the feed store. That wasn't a man who's given up. That was a man too proud to ask for help. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. You're offering charity. I'm offering mathematics. She opened the ledger, showed him columns of figures. My capital, your experience. Shared risk, shared return. The drought will break. They always do. Question is whether you'll have anything left when it does. And what do you get out of this? A partner who knows what he's doing. I'm educated, Mr. Mercer, but I'm not stupid. I know I can't run a ranch by myself. I also know I don't want to sell my brother's land to someone who'll strip it and move on. She closed the ledger. You're not the only one looking for something worth keeping.
Thomas stared at her for a long moment. In the corral behind her, 2 calves bawled for water that was running out. The sun beat down on land that used to grow grass thick enough to hide a man's boots. No, he said finally. I appreciate the offer, but I won't take charity. Not from anyone.
Clara nodded like she'd expected this answer. She pulled a calling card from her bag, simple ivory stock, black lettering. Set it on the porch rail. When you change your mind, she said. Not if, when. She walked back to her buggy, climbed up, released the brake. Looked back at him one more time. Pride is expensive, Mr. Mercer. I hope you can afford it. She drove off without waiting for a response.
Thomas stood on the porch, watching until the dust settled, then picked up the card. Clara Bennett. Bennett Property, Ridgeway. He should throw it away. He should go back to digging around the well, pretending he could save this place by himself. That night, another cow died in the east pasture. Thomas found her at dawn, lying in the dry grass with her calf pressed against her side, still trying to nurse from a body that had nothing left to give. He buried the cow and brought the calf back to the barn, fed it from a bucket of the little water they had left. Then he sat on the porch and stared at Clara Bennett's card until the sun came up full. He didn't throw it away. The saloon that evening was full of the usual crowd, ranchers, cowpunchers, townsmen looking for company and whiskey. Harold Dunn held court at his usual table by the window, nursing a glass of something better than the house pour. You hear about the Eastern widow? Someone asked. Went out to the Mercer place today. Harold raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Saw her buggy on the North Road. Coming back after maybe an hour. Interesting. Harold swirled his glass. What business would a widow have with Thomas Mercer? Who knows? Maybe she's sweet on him. The table laughed. Harold joined in, though his eyes stayed calculating. Women think she can save Thomas Mercer. He shook his head with theatrical pity. That's a drowning man if I ever saw one. She'll go down with him. He raised his glass. Give it 2 weeks, gentlemen. 2 weeks before she runs back to Cheyenne. Probably less. More laughter. Harold drained his glass and signaled for another. 60 days, he said to no one in particular. Shame about that property. Good land when the drought breaks. Very good land indeed. A week passed before Thomas Mercer knocked on Clara Bennett's door. She'd taken a room above the milliner's shop, respectable lodging for a widow, with a private entrance up the outside stairs. Thomas climbed those stairs in the early morning light, hat literally in his hands, trying to figure out what he was going to say. She opened the door before he finished deciding.
Mr. Mercer. Ma'am. He swallowed whatever pride he had left. That offer you made. The partnership, I'd like to discuss terms. Clara's expression didn't change. No triumph. No, I told you so. She simply stepped back and gestured toward a small table by the window. Terms are simple, she said once they were seated. I provide capital, you provide knowledge. We share the work and split the results when we sell. I can't take your money without offering something in return. You're offering your expertise. That has value, Mr. Mercer.
Call me Thomas. He'd never felt less like a Thomas in his life. What do you want me to do? Let me observe your operation for 1 week. No money changes hands. I want to understand what you're doing before I invest in it. She paused. And I want you to listen when I make suggestions. I may not know cattle, but I know numbers. My father was an accountant. I kept his books for 15 years before he died. Thomas considered this. A week of observation wasn't charity. It was due diligence. 1 week, he agreed. You watch. You ask questions. We'll see if you still want a partner when you understand what you're getting into.
Clara stood and offered her hand. He shook it, firm grip, no hesitation. Tomorrow morning, she said. First light, I'll bring my ledger. Clara arrived at the Mercer Ranch before dawn, driving the rented buggy herself. She wore practical clothes, a plain cotton dress, sturdy boots, her hair pinned up beneath a simple bonnet. Thomas met her at the gate, already 2 hours into his day. Where do we start? Water, Thomas said. Everything starts with water.
He walked her through the property, explaining as they went. The well was producing maybe 40 gallons a day, down from 100 at the start of the drought. The creek had stopped running in May. The stock pond was fed by runoff from the hills, but with no rain, it was losing 2 inches a week to evaporation and thirsty cattle. How many head do you have? Clara asked, ledger open. 87 last count, but that changes every few days. Show me.
They rode out to the pastures together, Thomas on his tired gelding, Clara handling a borrowed mare with more competence than he expected. She counted cattle as they went, making marks in her ledger. Asked about each animal's condition, age, breeding potential. By noon, she had pages of notes. By evening, she had questions. You're counting wrong, she said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table while Daniel cooked supper. Or rather, you're counting the wrong things. Thomas bristled. I've been ranching since I was younger than Daniel. I know how to count cattle. You know how to count dead cattle. Clara laid her ledger flat, showed him her columns. You've lost 47 head since the drought started. You're keeping track of every loss, every failure. But you're not tracking what you still have. I just told you. 87 head. No, 87 cattle on your land. But only 47 of them are healthy enough to survive another month of this drought. The other 40 are already dying. They're just doing it slowly. They're using water and feed that could keep the healthy ones alive. Thomas stared at the numbers. You want me to let 40 cattle die. I want you to save 47. Clara's voice was calm, precise. You can't save all of them. You don't have the water or the feed. But if you consolidate your resources, channel what's left of the creek runoff to a single stock pond, rotate grazing to 3 small sections instead of the whole range, you might keep the strong ones alive until the drought breaks. That's giving up. That's surviving. There's a difference.
Daniel set plates on the table, biscuits, salt pork, the last of the preserved vegetables from the cellar. He'd been quiet all day, watching the stranger measure his father's failure with her careful columns. Pa, he said quietly, maybe she's right. Maybe we should listen. Thomas looked at his son. 12 years old, already old enough to see the truth his father was refusing to face. Sarah would have said the same thing, if she were here. Sarah always knew when Thomas's pride was getting in the way of common sense. Show me, he said to Clara. Show me exactly what you're proposing. The next 3 days were the hardest work Thomas had done in years. Clara's plan was brutally logical. Dig trenches, 200 yards of them, to channel any creek runoff toward the biggest stock pond. Rotate the surviving cattle through 3 smaller sections of 40 acres each, letting the grass in the remaining 520 acres rest and maybe recover. Sell the 15 weakest cattle immediately, before they lost any more weight, and use the money to buy hay for the survivors. Thomas hated every part of it. Every trench felt like digging a grave for his pride. Every cow he selected for sale felt like admitting defeat. But the numbers didn't lie.
15 head at current weight, Clara calculated, watching the stockyard scales as the first batch was loaded. Average 900 pounds each. Market rate is $16 per hundredweight for drought cattle. That's $144 per head, but we'll call it $18 average to account for condition. Total, $270. The buyer, a middle-aged man from the Cheyenne stockyards, offered $15 flat. Drought cattle, he said with a shrug. That's the going rate. Clara opened her mouth to argue, but Thomas cut her off. 15. Fine, just take them. The buyer counted out $225. Clara recorded the amount in her ledger without comment, but Thomas saw her jaw tighten. That was worth $45, she said as they drove back to the ranch. $45 because you didn't want to negotiate. Negotiating felt like begging. Negotiating is business. This isn't about your feelings, Thomas. It's about survival.
He didn't answer. But that night, lying awake in his bed, he thought about what she'd said. How many other times had his pride cost him money? How many other times had he chosen feeling strong over being smart? By the end of the second week, the changes were visible. The remaining 47 cattle clustered around the consolidated stock pond, which now held runoff from the new trenches. The water level had actually risen 2 inches since they finished the digging. Not much, but enough to prove Clara's calculations were right. Daniel laughed more. The boy had thrown himself into the work with an energy Thomas hadn't seen in months, proud to be doing something that might actually help. At night, he asked Clara questions about her ledger, about numbers, about how counting things differently could change what you saw. "He's smart," Clara said one evening, sitting on the porch while Daniel cleaned up from supper. "Curious. He asks good questions. Gets that from his mother." Thomas looked out at the land, measuring the dying grass against the surviving cattle. "She was always the smart one. I just worked hard. Working hard is a kind of smart, just different." The comfortable silence stretched between them, something Thomas hadn't felt since Sarah's last good days. Dangerous, maybe, but not unwelcome.
The general store was crowded when Clara came to buy supplies. She'd grown accustomed to the stares, the whispers, the way conversation paused when she entered a room. Small towns had long memories and short patience for women who didn't fit expected patterns. Miss Bennett. She turned to find Harold Dunn standing behind her, bank-polished and smiling. "Mr. Dunn, can I help you with something?"
"A word, if you have a moment." He gestured toward the quieter corner of the store. Friendly advice, between neighbors. Clara followed, curious despite herself. "People are talking," Harold said, keeping his voice low enough that the other shoppers couldn't hear. "Your reputation's getting tangled with a failing rancher. Man's got maybe 45 days now, being generous. I'm saying this as friendly counsel. What do you see in him? There's nothing left."
Clara studied the banker's face. He was handsome in a well-fed way, confident in the manner of men who counted other people's money for a living. His concern was probably genuine in its own calculating fashion. "His son still trusts him," she said quietly. "His neighbor still checks on him. His cattle still follow him to the water." She paused. "That's not nothing, Mr. Dunn. That's everything." Harold's smile flickered, uncertainty crossing his polished features. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." She paid for her supplies and left him standing there, watching her walk out into the August heat.
The cattle buyer's name was Marcus Webb, and he arrived from Cheyenne on a Tuesday morning with a gleaming wagon and a predator's smile. "Thomas Mercer." Webb climbed down from his wagon. extended a hand that Thomas shook reluctantly. Heard you got cattle to sell. Thought I'd make you an offer before someone else scoops them up. Thomas looked past Webb to where Clara was walking toward them from the barn, ledger in hand as always. She'd been checking the cattle weights, measuring feed consumption, calculating how many more weeks they could survive on current rations. What kind of offer? Webb smiled wider. $15 a head. Cash on the barrel. Take the whole lot off your hands. And you can stop worrying about drought cattle. $15. That would be $705 for 47 head. Enough to make one bank payment. Maybe stretch a few more weeks. But it was robbery. Thomas knew what healthy cattle were worth. And even drought-stressed animals brought more than that at honest market. That's too low, he started. That's drought pricing, friend. Webb spread his hands in mock helplessness. Markets flooded with desperate sellers. I'm doing you a favor, even making an offer. Thomas felt his shoulders slump. What choice did he have? The cattle needed to sell eventually, and every day he waited, they lost more weight, more value. He reached for Webb's hand to shake on the deal.
Mr. Webb. Clara's voice cut across the yard, sharp and clear. May I see your calculations? Webb's smile faltered. Ma'am? Your calculations. Clara climbed the fence rail and walked toward them, ledger open. For the offer you just made. I'd like to understand your numbers. I don't see how that's any of your EOL. Thomas? Clara looked at him directly. Do you mind if I review Mr. Webb's terms?
Thomas hesitated. Every instinct told him to close the deal, take the money, stop negotiating before he embarrassed himself further. But Clara's eyes held that calculating steadiness he'd come to trust over the past 2 weeks. Go ahead, he said.
Clara stepped between the two men, opened her ledger to a page dense with figures. Mr. Webb, you're offering $15 per head. That's based on what estimate of weight and condition? Webb scowled. Standard drought cattle. 800 pounds average, maybe less. I see. Clara ran her finger down a column. I weighed every animal in Mr. Mercer's herd this morning. After 3 weeks of concentrated feeding and consolidated water sources, the average weight is 920 pounds. Market rate for cattle at that weight is $24 per hundredweight. She looked up. That's $22 per head minimum. You're offering $329 less than fair value.
Webb's face reddened. Now wait just a minute. -EOL. I could contact the stockyard in Cheyenne directly. Telegraph goes out this afternoon. I'm sure they'd be interested in knowing what prices their buyers are offering in drought country. Webb looked from Clara to Thomas and back again. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words he couldn't spit out. You going to let a woman handle your business, Mercer? Thomas felt something shift in his chest. The words landed differently than Webb intended, not an insult, but a question he'd already answered without realizing it. She's better at numbers than I am, Thomas said. Better than you too, apparently. Take the fair price or ride on. Webb stood there for a long moment, calculating odds that had turned against him. Finally, he pulled a billfold from his coat. $21, he said. Final offer, and I'll have my man collect them next week. Clara looked at Thomas. He nodded. 21 it is, Clara said, marking the figure in her ledger. That's $987, Mr. Webb. We'll expect payment before you move any cattle. Webb counted out the bills. Almost $1,000 in wrinkled paper that had probably passed through a dozen desperate hands before landing in Thomas's palm. The buyer left without another word, his wagon raising dust all the way to the main road. Thomas stared at the money. $987. Enough to pay Harold's personal loan, make 3 months of mortgage payments, and still have operating capital left over. You saved me $300, he said. Just now. $300 I would have given away because I was too proud to argue.
Clara closed her ledger. That's what partners do. We watch each other's blind spots. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time. Not the Eastern widow, not the stranger with the ledger. A woman who had watched him fail and fail and fail, and somehow still saw something worth saving. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate. "Don't thank me yet." Clara smiled, just slightly. "We've still got a ranch to save."
The town watched. The town always watched. They saw Thomas Mercer riding into town with Clara Bennett beside him on the wagon seat. They saw Daniel between them, laughing at something one of the adults had said. They saw the Mercer operation not dying as fast as expected, the cattle looking healthier than they had any right to look, the well still producing when it should have gone dry months ago. "You hear they turned down Marcus Webb's first offer?" Bill Hawkins said at the general store. "The woman made him pay $6 more per head." Did the math right there in front of him. Silas Fletcher shook his head, half admiring. Thomas Mercer let a woman negotiate for him? Apparently. And apparently she was right. "Hell of a thing," Bill said. "Hell of a thing." Evenings on the Mercer porch had become a ritual. After supper, Thomas and Clara would sit watching the sun set over land that was slowly, stubbornly refusing to die. Daniel would read by lamplight inside, or work on his sums. Clara had started teaching him account keeping, and the boy had taken to it like breathing.
"William died 3 years ago," Clara said one night, unprompted. "Typhoid. I nursed him for 6 weeks. Watched him waste away inch by inch, and couldn't do a thing to stop it." Thomas said nothing, just waited. "After he passed, I kept his books for the business we'd built together. Import-export, nothing glamorous. The partners bought me out eventually. Fair price." She paused. "I came west because my brother's letter said there might be something worth keeping out here. He died before I could visit, but the land was still waiting."
"I'm sorry," Thomas said, "about your husband, about your brother. I'm sorry about your wife." Clara looked at him. "Daniel told me she's buried on the hill. Said you go up there sometimes early morning. She would have liked you." The words came out before Thomas could stop them. "Sarah, I mean. She was the practical one, too. Always telling me when my pride was getting in the way of good sense. Was she right?" Thomas thought about all the times he'd refused help, refused advice, refused to admit he might not know everything. Usually, mostly. He shook his head, always.
"Pride's not all bad," Clara said. "Keeps us standing when everything else is trying to knock us down. It's just..." She trailed off. "Just what?" "It's knowing when to let it bend. Like your neighbor said. Land breaks, but character bends." She looked out at the pastures. "You bent more than you think, Thomas, these past few weeks. Letting me in, letting Daniel see you uncertain, letting the town watch you work with a woman partner. That takes more strength than standing alone."
Thomas felt something in his chest loosen. Something he'd been holding tight for 3 years, maybe longer. "You see too much," he said. "Anyone ever tell you that?" Clara smiled. "William used to say I saw through him like window glass. I told him that was the point of good bookkeeping. See what's really there, not what people want you to see. What do you see when you look at me?"
The question hung between them, dangerous and necessary. Clara turned to face him, that calculating gaze softer than he'd ever seen it. A man who lost everything except the one thing worth keeping. She paused. His integrity, his decency, the way he loves his son, tends his cattle, honors his debts even when he can't pay them. The way he gets up every morning and fights a battle he thinks he's losing, just because giving up would mean betraying who he is. Thomas couldn't speak, couldn't find words for what he was feeling. "That's what I see," Clara said quietly. "That's what I saw the first day, watching you at the feed store. A man worth believing in, even when he can't believe in himself."
They sat in silence as the stars came out. Two people on the edge of something neither had expected to find. Harold Dunn came to the ranch on the 1st of September. arriving in his polished buggy with papers in his leather satchel and satisfaction in his smile. "Thomas, Miss Bennet," he tipped his hat without meaning it. "I'm afraid I have some unfortunate business to discuss." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "What kind of business?" Harold produced a document from his satchel, load paper, faded ink. "2 years ago, during that bad winter, you signed a personal note for $150. Short-term loan to cover feed costs until spring." He laid the paper on the porch rail. "That note came due 6 months ago. I've been lenient, given your circumstances, but the bank requires me to call it in. 10 days, $150. You understand?" Thomas stared at the document. He remembered signing it. Desperate, winter closing in, cattle starving. He'd thought he'd paid it back. Must have confused it with another debt. "I don't have $150. "I'm aware." Harold's smile sharpened. "However, I might be willing to work out an arrangement. The deed to your property as collateral. Temporary, of course, just until you're back on your feet." Thomas knew what temporary meant. Lose the land either way, to Harold's terms or Harold's timeline.
I'll pay it, Clara said. I have $119 remaining for my inheritance. I can borrow against my property for the rest. Thomas turned on her. No. Thomas? Dad? I said no. The pride surged up like a wild horse. Fighting the bridle Clara had slowly been fitting around it. I won't be a man who hides behind a woman's money. Not for $150. Not for $1,000. Not for anything. Then be a man who accepts help from a partner. This isn't help. This is charity. This is you paying my debts because I can't pay them myself. That's what partnership means. Sharing the burden when -EOL. I don't need your help. Thomas was shouting now. Years of shame and failure boiling over. I don't need anyone's help. I built this place myself and I'll save it myself or lose it. But I won't. I can't. Clara's face went still. That calculating expression shut down, replaced by something Thomas couldn't read. I see, she said quietly. Very well. She walked down the porch steps, past Harold, who watched with barely concealed glee, and climbed into her buggy. She didn't look back as she drove away, the dust of her departure hanging in the dry air like a question.
Harold Dunn tucked the promissory note back into his satchel. 10 days, Thomas, he said pleasantly. I'll be in touch about the deed. The silence after Clara left was the loudest thing Thomas had ever heard. Daniel came out of the house, dinner half prepared, apron around his waist. Pa, where's Miss Clara going? Thomas couldn't answer, couldn't explain what he'd just done, what he'd just destroyed. Pa, go inside, Daniel. Finish supper. But -EOL inside. The boy went, hurt and confusion written across his young face. Thomas stood on the porch until the sun went down, watching the road Clara had taken, waiting for something he couldn't name. She didn't come back. 3 days later, old Jack Hendricks found Thomas sitting on the porch at midnight, lamp burned out. Bottle of whiskey 2/3 empty at his feet. Jack didn't say anything. Just sat down beside him and waited. I broke it, Thomas said finally. Whatever we were building, I broke it. I noticed. Jack didn't reach for the whiskey. Didn't seem to judge it either. What happened? Thomas told him. The loan, Harold's demand, Clara's offer, his own explosion. The words came out broken, disconnected, like he was describing something that had happened to someone else. So you sent away the one person trying to help you, Jack said when he finished. Because accepting help felt worse than failing alone. She deserves better than a failing rancher too proud to know when he's drowning. Maybe, Jack leaned back against the porch rail. Or maybe she saw something in you worth saving, and you couldn't stand to be saved. Thomas laughed, hollow. That's what she said. That I was worth believing in. Woman sounds smart. She is. Smarter than me, that's for sure. Then why are you arguing with her judgment? Thomas didn't have an answer for that. Jack was quiet for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than Thomas had ever heard it. Pride's a good fence, Thomas. Keeps trouble out. Keeps judgment out, too. Pause. But it also keeps help out. Sometimes keeps love out, too. Jack. Dash. I'm not finished. The old man turned to look at him, eyes bright in the darkness. I told you character survives when everything else breaks. I meant it. But character isn't the same as stubbornness. Character means knowing when to stand and when to bend, knowing when your own judgment is wrong, and being man enough to admit it. I can't be the man who couldn't save his own ranch. Son, that ranch is dirt and grass. It'll die and grow back 100 times after we're both forgotten. Jack's voice caught. Your boy watching you accept help with grace. That's what he'll remember 50 years from now. That's what lasts. Not whether you save 600 acres. Whether you showed him how a man asks for help when he needs it. Thomas felt something break inside him. Not the ranch, not his pride, but something older. Harder. Something he'd been carrying since Sarah died, and he realized he was going to have to raise a boy alone. Run a ranch alone. Face every storm alone, because that's what men did. The tears came without warning. The first he'd cried since Sarah's funeral. 4 years of failure, of shame, of pretending he was strong enough to handle everything himself. It all came out in ragged sobs he couldn't control. Jack didn't move, didn't try to comfort him or quiet him down. Daniel did. The boy appeared on the porch, drawn by the sound of his father breaking. He sat down beside Thomas without a word, put his small hand on his father's shaking shoulder, stayed there while Thomas cried out 3 years of drought and loss and pride. When the tears finally stopped, Daniel spoke. It's okay, Pa. His voice was steady, older than 12. You don't have to be strong all the time. Miss Clara said that's what partners are for. Thomas looked at his son, this boy who had watched him fail and still believed in him anyway. Sarah's eyes. Sarah's steadiness. She's right, Thomas said, voice raw. She's been right about everything. He rode to town before dawn. The streets were empty, the general store still shuttered, the saloon dark and quiet. Thomas tied his horse and climbed the outside stairs to Clara's room above the milliner's shop. His hat was in his hands, literally, this time, not just a figure of speech. He knocked, waited, knocked again.
Clara opened the door in a practical dressing gown, hair down around her shoulders, eyes soft with sleep that sharpened when she saw who stood there. Thomas. I was wrong. The words came out before he could second-guess them. I was proud. I was scared. I'm still scared. He paused, trying to find the next sentence. But I'd rather fail with you than succeed alone. If you'll still have me, as a partner. Clara studied him in the gray light of early morning. Her face was unreadable. Just a partner.
Thomas felt his heart hammering. I don't have much to offer beyond partnership. 47 cattle. A boy who needs a mother. A ranch that might not survive. He swallowed. And a heart that's finally learned to accept help, if that's worth anything to you.
Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached behind the door and pulled out her ledger. It's worth everything, she said. It's worth more than land or cattle or money or any of the things I came out here counting. She stepped through the doorway, closed it behind her. Now let's go pay Mr. Dunn before he starts his day feeling good about himself.
They walked through the waking town together, side by side, past the general store where the porch sitters would gather in an hour, past the saloon where men had laughed at the idea of Clara saving a drowning man, past the boarding house and the livery in the church. People who saw them would remember it later, Thomas Mercer and the Bennett woman, walking to the bank in the early morning light, her hand on his arm, both of them looking straight ahead like they knew exactly where they were going.
Harold Dunn looked up from his desk to find them standing in his doorway. His smile flickered, uncertain. "Thomas, Miss Bennet, you are early." "We have business," Clara said, walking in without invitation. She set her ledger on Harold's desk and opened it to a page covered in neat figures. "Mr. Mercer's outstanding obligations and our plan for addressing them." Harold's eyes moved from the ledger to Thomas to Clara and back. "I wasn't aware you were still involved in his situation." "Partners share situations, Mr. Dunn. That's the definition." Thomas watched Clara lay out the numbers with the same precision she'd used on Marcus Webb. Cattle sale proceeds, $987. Feed savings from rotation method, $145. Remaining inheritance capital, $118. Total available funds, $1,250. Against that, Harold's personal loan of $150. 3 months of mortgage payments at $85 per month, $255. Total immediate obligations, $405. That leaves $845 in operating capital, Clara concluded. More than enough to carry the combined operation to the winter. Mr. Mercer's 640 acres of grazing land, plus my 80 acres with water rights. 720 acres total.
Harold leaned back in his chair. Combined operation? We're merging the properties. Clara's voice was level. Joint ownership. Shared resources. I have the draft agreement here, if you'd like to review it. Harold studied the papers she produced. His eyes moved down the columns, checking figures, looking for weaknesses, finding none. "The numbers are solid," he admitted finally. "Better than solid, actually. Thank you. I didn't say I was impressed." But his tone suggested otherwise. He looked at Thomas. "You got a good partner, Mercer. Better than you probably deserve." Thomas met his eyes without flinching. "I know." The signing took 20 minutes. Papers exchanged, debts cleared, 3 months of security purchased. When they walked out of the bank into the bright September morning, Thomas felt like he was breathing clean air for the first time in years. "It's not saved yet," Clara said, reading his expression. "We've bought time. That's all. Time is more than I had yesterday. Time is what we do with it." She touched his arm. "We need to get back to the ranch. The hay delivery arrives this afternoon." They walked to where their horses were tied side by side, partners in something that had grown beyond business without either of them planning it. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Mornings, Thomas and Daniel worked the cattle while Clara managed the accounts. Afternoons, they all worked together, digging irrigation channels, reinforcing fence lines, preparing the winter shelter. Evenings, they sat on the porch and talked about everything and nothing until the stars came out. The town watched as the town always did. "Mercer operations still running," Bill Hawkins reported at the general store. "Cattle look decent. Saw them selling off 20 head last week at fair market price." "Thought he was finished," Silas Fletcher said. "So did everyone." Bill shrugged. "Guessed that Bennett woman knew what she was doing." The September rains came, not much, but enough. The stock pond rose 4 inches. The grass started showing green at the edges. 47 cattle drank deep and put on weight that would carry them through winter. Thomas found himself watching Clara the way he used to watch the weather, constantly, carefully, learning her patterns. The way she frowned at numbers that didn't add up. The way she smiled when Daniel mastered a new calculation. The way she stood at the fence line some evenings, looking out at land that was slowly, stubbornly refusing to die. "What are you thinking?" he asked her one night, standing beside her at that fence. That this might actually work, she turned to look at him. Not just the ranch, all of it. Thomas reached for her hand. She let him take it. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Feelings. Words. I spent so long keeping everything inside that I forgot how to let anything out. You're learning." Her fingers tightened around his. "That's enough. That's more than enough." Sunday morning. Church service, then the usual gathering in the yard where everyone caught up on the week's news. Thomas and Clara stood together, Daniel between them, when Harold Dunn approached. The banker's expression was difficult to read, something between reluctant admiration and calculation. "Mercer, Miss Bennet." He nodded to each of them. "I've been reviewing your combined operation proposal, the one you submitted for potential investment. And, the numbers are sound. Better than sound." Harold addressed the small crowd that had gathered, drawn by the novelty of the banker speaking to the failing rancher like an equal. "Anyone interested in investing in the Mercer Bennett operation can see me at the bank. Conservative returns, minimal risk." The crowd murmured. Thomas felt a dozen pairs of eyes on him, people who had watched him fail, whispered about his coming ruin, expected him to disappear into foreclosure and shame. "I was wrong about you, Mercer," Harold said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "About both of you. Town needs more operations like what you're building." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was as close as Harold Dunn would ever come. Thomas turned to face the crowd. These people who had known him his whole life, who had watched his father build this ranch from nothing, who had attended his wedding, his wife's funeral, every triumph and failure in between. "I want to thank you all," he said, voice steady, "for not giving up on me, for checking in even when I pushed you away, for believing there might be something worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." He looked at Clara, at Daniel, at old Jack standing in the back, eyes bright. "But mostly, I want to thank Clara Bennett. She came to settle her brother's estate and found something she wasn't looking for. A failing rancher too proud to ask for help. She saw what I couldn't see, that character matters more than cattle, and accepting help takes more strength than standing alone." Clara's eyes glistened. She didn't look away. "3 months ago I had nothing to offer anyone," Thomas continued. "Today I have 47 cattle, a boy who needs a mother, and a heart that's finally learned to bend instead of break." He took Clara's hand. "If she'll have me, not just as a partner, but as something more, I'd like to spend the rest of my life learning how to be worthy of what she saw in me." Clara's smile was the most beautiful thing Thomas had ever seen. "I accept," she said simply. Daniel let out a whoop and threw his arms around both of them. Old Jack wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. Even Harold Dunn managed something that might have been a genuine smile. The applause started slowly and built until the whole churchyard was clapping, celebrating a man who had lost everything except the one thing worth keeping, and the woman who had seen it when no one else could. They married in October when the autumn light turned the surviving grass to gold. It was a small ceremony on the ranch porch, with 47 cattle grazing the recovering pastures in the background. Old Jack officiated. He'd been justice of the peace for 30 years, though he joked he'd never married off a rancher to his accountant before. Daniel held the ring, standing straight and proud in his Sunday best. The town came, all of them, even the ones who had whispered and doubted. They crowded the yard with covered dishes and wedding wishes, turning the Mercer Ranch into something it hadn't been in years, a place of celebration instead of sorrow. "You're supposed to be nervous," Claire whispered as they stood before Jack. "I spent 3 years terrified of losing everything," Thomas whispered back. "This is the first time I've been sure of anything." The vows were simple. The kiss was sweet. Daniel's cheers were loud enough to startle the cattle. After the ceremony, after the food and the dancing and the endless congratulations, Thomas and Clara stood at the fence line watching the sun set over their combined land. 720 acres stretching toward the mountains. Her water-rich parcel connected to his grazing land by a new fence line. 2 properties becoming one, just like 2 lives. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked. Thomas smiled at the familiar question. "That I spent 3 years trying to save a ranch. Didn't know the ranch wasn't worth keeping. What was?" He turned to look at her. This woman who had appeared from nowhere and seen through him like window glass, just like she'd done with her husband's accounts, who had counted his failures and found something worth saving anyway. "You, Daniel, Jack," The people who stayed when everything else left. He pulled her close. That's what the drought couldn't kill. Not the land or the cattle or the money. Just the people who keep showing up no matter what. Clara leaned against him, solid and certain.
The drought will end eventually, she said. Next year maybe, the year after. And when it does, we'll be ready. We'll be ready, Thomas agreed. Whatever comes. Daniel appeared at the fence, old Jack beside him. The four of them stood together in the fading light, a family pieced together from fragments, held together by something stronger than blood or law. So what happens now? Daniel asked. Thomas looked at his son, at Clara, at the land that had nearly broken him, and at the old man who had taught him that character bends but holds. Now we rebuild, he said, one day at a time, together.
The rains came in November. Not the gentle September drizzle that had teased them, but real rain, days of it, soaking into ground that had forgotten what moisture felt like. The stock pond filled to the brim. The creek bed showed water for the first time in 18 months. The grass put out new shoots so green they almost hurt to look at. Thomas and Clara stood on the porch watching it fall.
The ledger's looking good, Clara said. If prices hold, we'll clear enough to expand the herd in spring. Maybe add a second breeding bull. The ledger's always looking good when you're keeping it. She elbowed him gently. That's what partners do.
Inside, Daniel was practicing his sums by lamplight, tongue stuck out in concentration the way Thomas remembered doing himself at that age. Old Jack had stopped by for supper and was now dozing in the rocker by the fire, full of food and contentment. I couldn't have done this without you, Thomas said. Any of it. That's the point. Clara took his hand. No one can do everything alone. The strongest thing a man can do is let people help carry the weight. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise. She smiled. You just weren't listening. Thomas laughed, a real laugh, full and free, the kind he hadn't made in years. The sound brought Jack awake and Daniel to the window, both of them grinning at something they couldn't quite explain but could absolutely feel. Pa sounds happy, Daniel said. Your pa is happy, Thomas said, coming inside with Clara. Happier than he's been in a long time. They gathered around the table for one more cup of coffee before Jack headed home. 4 people who had been strangers 6 months ago, now bound together by something stronger than circumstance. To surviving, Clara said, raising her cup. To bending without breaking, Jack added. To family, Daniel said, proud to be included. Thomas looked at each of them in turn. His son, growing into a young man who would know how to ask for help when he needed it. His neighbor, who had lost everything and rebuilt and shared his wisdom just when Thomas needed it most. His wife, who had seen through his pride to the man beneath and decided he was worth saving. To being seen, Thomas said quietly, and to the people who see us. They drank together as the rain fell outside, filling stock ponds and reviving pastures and washing away 3 years of dust and despair. The drought was ending. The land would recover. The cattle would multiply. But none of that mattered as much as the people sitting around this table. None of it lasted as long as the love that had taken root in impossible soil. What the drought couldn't kill wasn't the ranch. It was the man who finally learned that being loved and being worthy were 2 different things. She saw his worth before he did. All he had to do was believe her. Years later, Daniel would tell his own children about the summer that nearly broke their family. He told them about the drought that dried up the creek and killed the cattle, about his father's pride and his mother's persistence, about old Jack's wisdom and Harold Dunn's unlikely transformation from enemy to ally. But mostly he told them about the woman who arrived one dusty afternoon with a ledger and a proposition, who looked at their failing ranch and saw something worth keeping. What was it? His children would ask. What did she see? Daniel would smile the way his father used to smile, slow and sure, and full of something too big for words. She saw his heart, he would say. Everything else was just land and cattle. But his heart, that was the one thing worth keeping. And once he believed her, everything else fell into place. The children would nod, not quite understanding but sensing the truth of it anyway, the way all children sense the important things before they have words for them. And Daniel would look out at the ranch, 720 acres now, thriving through droughts and winters and all the storms the frontier could throw at them, and remember a time when all of it nearly disappeared, when his father sat on the porch at midnight, broken by pride and shame, and a boy's hand on his shoulder reminded him that he didn't have to be strong all the time. That's what family was for. That's what partnership meant. Carrying the weight together so no one had to carry it alone. The portrait hung above the fireplace in the Mercer home for 3 generations. It showed 4 people standing on a ranch porch, a tall man with weathered hands, a woman with calculating eyes, a boy holding a leather ledger, and an old man in the background with a knowing smile. Behind them, cattle grazed on grass that had survived the worst drought in living memory. The inscription beneath it was simple: what remains when everything else is lost? Visitors would ask about it sometimes. Who were those people? What was the story? The answer was always the same. A man who thought he had nothing, a woman who saw everything, and a stubborn, impossible, beautiful truth that love, real love, doesn't wait for us to be worthy of it. It just sees us, sees what we are, what we could be, what we're fighting so hard to protect. And it stays. Through drought and plenty, pride and humility, failure and recovery. It stays. The end